It's easy to hear your favorite artist on WFPK from wherever you are. Listen on your smart speaker, live stream from our website at WFPK.org, from Louisville Public Media.
Consequence Podcast Network.
And welcome to another edition of Kyle Meredith with the interview series presented by WFPK at WFPK.org, Consequence of Sound, and the Consequence Podcast Network. I want to thank everybody who checks us out every single week and the new episodes, the new interviews. We release new ones every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, so thank you for subscribing and thank you for the comments. Let me know where you're listening from. Questions about the interviews. Always appreciate hearing from every single one of you. Of course, if you're not a subscriber, may I take this moment to entice you by saying you can get us at any of the popular spots, including iTunes and Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Just type in Kyle Meredith with, hit subscribe. We'll take care of the rest. I'm Kyle Meredith, and today it's a doozy. I'm talking with Kim Thayil of Soundgarden. Now, I've talked before about the importance of Soundgarden in my life, especially the few times I've been able to talk to Krist before his passing, just that they were the band. They were the band that changed my life. It happened, back in middle school when I heard the song Spoon Man, and that's why I'm here. So being able to talk to Kim, it's another big deal. And let me tell you, we cover a lot of ground, a whole lot of grounds on this interview. We start out because it's the 30th anniversary of the Screaming Life FOPP compilation. Now, it's not the anniversary of those separate EPs because they did combine them to make a CD package in 1990, but before that, they were 80s EPs. We're still going to talk about that, though. We're going to talk a lot about discography and how the band sees some of their albums versus the record label who put a lot of the stuff together as well. But we'll start back in those early days. I want to talk about how and when they realized that their sound was different, because Soundgarden was a very different band, being influenced by their peers like the Melvins and Malfunkshun, as well as classics like Zeppelin and Sabbath, Kiss, and the Beatles. We'll hear about some of the songs like Little Joe, get into time signatures, before and after Matt Cameron. I know he plays a part of that as well. In fact, Kim tells us bringing in Matt Cameron, one of the things was they wanted everyone to be a songwriter, and that kind of played into that. We'll also hear about songs they released in 1990, like Room 1,000 Years Wide and HIV Baby. We'll jump to 1995 for the curio called the Alive in the Superunknown CD-ROM. And in fact, it was around that time, Kim also tells us, when he wrote for Encarta. If you remember the Windows, what was that? It's encyclopedia, Encarta. And from there, the anniversaries continue. For 2000 for the CD release, the now out of print No WTO Combo, which brings us into the present before the end of it. I do promise you that. He tells us he did have a tour lined up with Dave Alvin, famous of the Blasters. Of course, that got called off, as every tour got called off. And I want to know why there's been no solo record from Kim to this point. He wrote a lot of Soundgarden's early songs. So what's kept him from doing that, from making that jump, and will he in the future? So let's jump into it. Without further ado, it's Kyle Meredith with Kim Thayil of Soundgarden. I got to say, first off, it's, of course, a huge honor to be talking to you here. Soundgarden is a band that changed my life, and I've loved watching what you've been doing through the years. So thanks for taking the time to do this call today. And it's interesting because when I was looking up some of the anniversary stuff, I came across the Screaming Life FOPP compilation, and it's turning 30. It would have been 30 years old, but it's sort of cheating, right? Because this is really two EPs that were released years earlier, so it's technically not the big round anniversary, right, but it is. So
yeah, exactly. Screaming Life was released in 87, so that would make it about almost 33 years, and FOPP was released in 88. Of course, they had different producers, different engineers, but Screaming Life, we considered an album already because it was our first record, and back then in the 80s, new bands, especially new bands in coming out of the indie alternative or punk rock scenes, would put out EPs, and that would be their initial album. Big Black did that, Butthole Surfers did that, Sonic Youth did that, Meat Puppets, Minutemen, on and on. So this is our, sixth song. Screaming Life was 6 songs. They're all produced by Jack and Dino. It's on a distinct label, Sub Pop. Well, soon to be huge label,
Right.
But at that point, we thought, hey, this is our debut record. We recorded enough material for an album, but Bruce, I think Jonathan wanted to do a full album, but Bruce wisely thought it was good to do a shorter record, do like anywhere from 4 to 5 songs. We pushed to get 6 songs on it so we can have 3 on each side, just make it symmetrical, I suppose. And the goal was we wanted to get as much of our material out there as possible. They wanted to be able to have a great retail price point, the price point of an EP, to introduce this new band and along the label. I think around the same time, FOPP put out Dry as a Bone by Green River, just a little bit before Screaming Life. And I consider that an album as well, but it was like a 5-song punk rock EP, punk rock album.
Right.
They would just call EPs. So, yeah. But they officially made an album by pairing it with FOPP in 1990 for CD. That's the weird thing, because both of those EPs came out on vinyl, but they're compiled for CD and cassette in 90 and did not come out for vinyl again until a couple years back. I think, I got to correct myself, I think in the 90s at some point they did a limited edition like collector's vinyl run, but I think of just Screaming Life, I think the compilation of FOPP and Screaming Life together was compiled for vinyl for the first time back when we threw it together in, what was that, 2014, I think, 2015?
Well, it's interesting in that regard then, too, because if you were just hearing those EPs for the first time once they were compiled to CD, they're different sounds. I mean, this is a different band from one selection to the next. Not an entirely different band, obviously, but there's a difference between Screaming Life FOPP. That's the way I heard it. When I heard it, I probably went and found those. I grew up in rural Kentucky, so I know I didn't hear about you guys until Superunknown, so I would have heard it after that. And I remember hearing this record, not knowing the story behind it, and going, well, this is an interesting, switch of gears suddenly. This is for audiences to find you like that. That's I don't know if that's ever a worry on you, or you just kind of let it go as it's going to go. But that's an interesting way to have your music received anyway.
Yeah, that's why on the CD I think they emphasize Screaming Life in terms of the packaging, then listed the FOPP songs as a bonus. We definitely see, and still to this day see, Screaming Life as an album. It was all original material, produced by Jack and Dino. Sub Pop debut, that is the album for Sub Pop and Jack and Dino. Always believing that in the future we'd release the rest of the material we recorded in some capacity. That was what was understood. FOPP is more of a single, even though they're both kind of roughly marketed as EPs. FOPP was definitely built around the song FOPP, which was a cover, and then a remix that Steve Fisk did. And we threw one Soundgarden original, and we did another cover as a lark of our peers. We did a Green River cover for fun. So we just saw that as correctly as an EP or a maxi single, I think they may have called it. But EPs were basically maxi singles. They're built around one song.
Right.
You might add an edit or another version. So that correctly is an EP, whereas Screaming Life for almost all purposes is a vinyl. Album. When we put it together, we see it as Screaming Life, and then this bonus EP added, or bonus single added.
Well, I will take the opportunity to talk about 1990, some actual stuff that happened in that year for the anniversary. But since we're here, a couple of the songs I wanted to hit on, though, with those first singles being on there, with Hunted Down and the flip with Nothing to Say. I mean, so much has been written about the sound that came out of the area that you all were doing. But in that moment, were you aware as a band, even as an individual, of how different you all did sound from everything else that was really going on in the world?
Yeah, we knew that we were aware that we were kind of quirky post-punk. And then we started incorporating these more psychedelic elements. And the psychedelic elements, the way we presented them was heavier. So we realized that we somehow, through a side door, had kind of redefined elements of, I guess at the time we might have thought, gee, we're grabbing some heavy metal elements, maybe classic rock elements, which was what the journalists would eventually throw in these classic rock references. And we thought, well, Black Flag had done this, the Melvins, St. Vitus. There was a thing going on with people our age who were kind of into punk rock, but kind of reaching back a little bit further to some of the guilty pleasures that might have informed them as kids or teenagers, you know, things like Sabbath or Zeppelin or, God. For me, I was listening to that stuff when I was, junior high or high school. Then by the time I'm 16 or 17, out come the Sex Pistols and Ramones. And that happens to be the time that I started learning to play guitar. It was just, the timing was ridiculous, coinciding with my age, with the pop culture age, of both rock and roll and of the baby boomer, Generation X demographic. It all just kind of fit. It's like, wow, And then in the mid 80s, we kind of were doing Soundgarden was doing what we did, and I think the other bands, Green River, Melvins, Malfunkshun, they're all to some degree informed in their early years by classic rock, and then kind of came into being musicians as kind of punk rock guys or post-punk rock guys, and kind of started dipping back into the things you'd shed as kids with Zeppelin and Sabbath and stuff like that, and Kiss. There's a Kiss thing going around here too. I remember that.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to say that one. I knew you talked about it when you were younger.
Yeah.
It is interesting though, because I think that's how it happens most of the time. Bands sort of just stumble on sounds, but most bands, not all of them, but most bands are emulating either their heroes or what they're hearing on the radio currently. And I think that's what's always fascinated me about the few that have, within those parameters, still found their way to something new, and hearing now, going back and hearing that first single with Hunted Down and Nothing to Say, it's like there's nothing to compare it to exactly, what was happening at the time. And I wasn't working at that point. I was much younger, but I can't imagine, being a critic at the time or a listener, a fan or whatever, and hearing that for the first time and going, huh. It's like we would have done years later when Kid A would have came out or something like that. Like, well, this is not what I was expecting. It's just one of those moments.
Right. I don't think there was ever a time where we were consciously emulating, any particular genre or sound. I mean, we were certainly playing what we were familiar with, what we learned as we learned our instruments. As I was learning how to play guitar, probably the first riff I learned might have been Smoke on the Water by Deep Purple. And I wouldn't be alone in that. There's like thousands of people that were like that. But then I went on and learned Ramones and Sex Pistols songs, the Devo songs. So there's a way which you become familiar with your instrument. There's a way you become familiar with your turntable or your car stereo. And that's kind of what we weren't trying to do that. It just was kind of what we knew and how we communicated with each other. It was sort of part of that culture or the subculture that we had kind of defined ourselves as individuals and found ourselves in as friends. I remember if there was an influence, it might have been from some of our peers, seeing bands like the Melvins or Malfunkshun going from really fast to kind of slow and grooving, and and Black Flag doing something similar, St. Vitus. I guess it acknowledged that the parameters for punk rock were a lot broader than we may have allowed it to have been initially, in the early 80s or late 70s. So to go back to the question you asked a few minutes ago, I think we knew it sounded different, mostly because people would point that out. But I think to us it was very natural. It's kind of what we listened to in a weird amalgam. It's just
right.
Playing Bauhaus and then playing, Black Flag and then playing the Meat Puppets and then playing Sabbath. It just was part of, who we all were, or certainly part of what Chris and Hero and I was.
So with all of that context, the one song I really do want to ask about then is Little Joe, because that's always been a curio to me. Where does that come from in all of this?
So that was weird. That was a song instrumentally that I'd written before in my head before I picked up a guitar. I remember describing it to Chris and Hero. I remember describing it dynamically. It's like, well, you have this kind of wiry sort of riff winding around, maybe a little bit Eastern. And then you kind of get to like more of you have this space with bass in it, and just kind of like do these harmonic things, which I'd done before, in a lot of our songs. And so just kind of keep it sort of ambient and spacey, then make it kind of heavy, which is what we're about. And so then Chris was a at the time, Krist had been our drummer, but he was very much involved in arrangements from the perspective of a drummer, and as a singer, as well as he's writing the lyrics. But I think they asked me to illustrate what I meant, picked up the guitar, and okay, something like this. I did something wiry, and then I kind of moved over to those 3 chords, left some space for the bass to define itself. It's like, and then it does this, and then we go to this dynamic section. So the song was arranged dynamically. In how I saw, in the way I described, and then the parts were kind of written around the dynamic arrangement. It's just at the end we'll just kind of go into these solos and kind of jam. So that's how that one came about. The fact that it has that kind of weird rhythmic thing, I probably attribute that to the way Hero and Matt played. It was supposed to be a little bit more wiry and Eastern, but it certainly has a bit of both. So yeah, it is distinctly different from the other stuff. I think Chris's vocals kind of had a bit of because he's a drummer, he certainly had that rhythmic sense to the melody line, and it kind of was, I don't want to at all say it has any hip-hop isms, but because the vocals are kind of rhythmically oriented as well, it was weird for us, but we liked it.
Yeah.
So,
This record isn't what I call a fun record. It's a cool record. It's an awesome record. That's a fun song, is what it ends up being. That's the fun song on a cool record, or something like that. And I want to bring it up.
Everything else is kind of dark.
Well, you mentioned Matt there too, and that was another part of it too, because now that I can hear what Matt did in with you in Soundgarden, and then what he brought to Pearl Jam, it was a lot about time signatures. He especially brought that to the Pearl Jam crew later on, and shifted what they did. But it was it started as a Soundgarden thing. How important, was that actually part of your conversations, like these shifting time signatures, these odd numbers that were put together?
Well, we were doing that before Matt. We were doing that with Krist when Krist was our drummer. We were a 3-piece, Krist and Hero and I, because that's kind of the way I wrote, kind of the way Hero wrote. We weren't really aware of the time signature until we were done writing something, and then someone would say, that's kind of weird. Usually it might be Krist would say, that's in 5, and Hero would sit there trying to count it out, and we'd have a bunch of beer in us trying to count this thing out. Is it 5 or is it 7? Let me try it again. And we would figure that out after the fact, because we would think it felt weird, or we'd play it live and someone would come up and go, that song you do in 5/4, what's it called? And we'd have to think, what song do we do in 5/4? But with Matt, we consciously were soliciting somebody who was part of our scene. He played with Skinyard. We knew him. We knew he was one of the 2 best drummers in our scene easily. We knew that he liked us, and we knew that he had his independence of his 4 limbs, and that he could play the weird stuff that we used to write. Now, in between, we had a drummer named Scott Sundquist. He was not so comfortable with the 5s and 7s that we did a lot, but he had a swing sensibility. So he'd play in 4s and 3s and 6s really well. And that's kind of what happened. We went from quirky post-punk to kind of being more psychedelic and groovy and heavy and jammy with Scott, who had that swing sensibility. With Matt, he brought back this ability to interpret the weird stuff that we were always naturally writing, the stuff in 5s and 7s and things like that.
It made, again, such a unique sound with all of you, and to further us, actually into 1990, because you did have releases during that year. I know you're on tour for Loud Love. The Loudest Love EP came out with the Louder Than Live VHS, and I think I still have to call it that. I think it's the only VHS at this point. Yeah. Which I do have. Come Together was a cover on that EP. I've heard Krist, I have talked to Krist. I had talked to Krist a few times in the past. He had a very vocal love of the Beatles. Was that shared with everybody? Because hearing you talk about the obvious things, Zeppelin, Sabbath, Kiss and all that, were the Beatles also, a group thing for you?
Yeah, the Beatles were huge when I was definitely a kid. I think the first album I ever got was the Beatles' Hey Jude, which was a compilation of some singles. And then I think when I was in 5th grade for Christmas, I got Sgt. Pepper's and Revolver, and they're just amazing. I think by the time I was in 6th grade, I bought a black light at Sears and screwed it in. It was the shape of a traditional light bulb. So I just kind of unscrewed the light bulb in my room and screwed in the black light and listened to the Beatles. So it was very important. I think I went a number of different directions by getting into metal and then punk and then stuff like Perubu and Chrome. So I was kind of leaving the Beatles behind because there was so much stuff coming out in the late 70s. And I think Krist kind of held on to the Beatles a little bit longer as someone who's writing more vocal lines. I think he was oriented more towards the Beatles and their sense of melody. And I'm at this point I'm getting into guitars, but and weird noises and dynamic approaches to songwriting and arrangement. I would definitely say the Beatles had its place with Ben, with Hero, with Matt. It was definitely a big thing. I think it might have been strongest with Chris, but that's not to downplay the fact that it was the biggest thing in my life for years.
Right.
By the way, I wanted to mention the other reason why we got Matt was because he could write songs. It wasn't just that he was the greatest drummer in the world, but he could write songs, and we wanted a drummer. We wanted everyone in the band to be a songwriter. We wanted everyone to contribute. We thought that would just create a larger set from which to draw from, that our albums would be stronger, that everyone can contribute to the particular insider vision that someone would have. And it worked. Everyone would add their 2 cents. People would add their criticisms. Songs would be adjusted, and we could make things the best Soundgarden song.
I mean, that happened really quickly too. I know the single that came out that year, "Room 1,000 Years Wide," that was you and Matt on that one. I think "HIV Baby" was also on that one. So
that's funny you would say that, because it was my idea that on that single, because I wrote the lyrics for Matt's music on "Room 1,000 Years Wide." The flip side, we had Chris writing lyrics for Ben's music on "HIV Baby." But the actuality is I wrote some of the riffs on "HIV Baby" too, but I thought it would be cool if one side said Phil Cameron and the other side said Cornell Shepherd.
Oh, yeah.
And so I took my name off of "HIV Baby" for the purpose of that single. But the riff underneath the guitar solo, that's me. But everything else is very signature band. So yeah, so we were very conscious of that fact, to show that kind of democratic and versatile nature of the band in terms of songwriting.
Which would show itself so much on the future albums too, because there were a lot of sounds that would come through in those records, and and some of them, in those poppy moments and some of those spaced out moments, like I would say, especially on some of those singles right there. And if you don't mind, I'll pull up 5 years, because we talk about big anniversaries like the 25th. The Alive and the Superunknown CD-ROM thing came out. I mean, and that had some weird stuff on it too. Wasn't that was like Jerry Garcia's finger, right? That was the really bizarre one that I remember from that one.
Yep. Well, by the way, all those little loose ends or what we call B-sides, things that were compiled on EPs or international releases or singles or movie soundtracks, we put up. That's the significance of Echo of Miles,
right?
Where we collected. There's 50 songs that we collect. I always had kept a track of these songs, as a wish list for a future album. As it grew really large, because the label always wanted bonus material for Europe or Australia wanted an extra song, for the CD, or to back the single. Is there another song that you guys have? And they always wanted this. So I kept a running tally, because these were songs that were not on a Soundgarden album. And when we ended up with like a dozen or so of them, we thought, this is a Soundgarden album that is thrown across the world in all these different formats. We need to compile these together and put them out. And that was something I wanted to do around the time the band broke up for the first time, 97, and finally got to do with Echo of Miles. And just, I know I'm maybe digressing a bit, but just to bring it back here for a second, you mentioned the Loudest Love EP, right? And then you mentioned Alive and the Superunknown. Now those are not band initiated. Those are very much EPs in the sense of them being label generated samplers. Screaming Life's a Soundgarden album. FOPP is a Soundgarden original. That's something that we performed and recorded and released new songs. Loudest Love, I think, was compiled initially. It might have been for an overseas EP that was put out here. It was kind of compiled as a sampler by the label, and then they came to us and said, do you have any other songs that aren't on the album? And we were always resistant to doing that, but we knew we needed to do that. So we said, okay, someday these songs will end up on a Soundgarden album. So Loudest Love, every time I read Wikipedia or read our discography, and I see those references to EPs like Loudest Love and Alive in the Superunknown, I think, those are not Soundgarden records. Those are label records.
Yeah.
And Alive in the Superunknown, I think the goal there was to showcase some of the new, increasingly popular digital,
Right.
tech. And I think there's some really crude, rudimentary animation in Alive in the Superunknown. I think like there's some Easter eggs and a weird little menu that you could. It's really just kind of simple, and you could. But it was something the label wanted to do with some of the new technologies. We'll put out the CD-ROM, right? So it has video content and a menu that you can kind of navigate. And I think there might have been some ridiculous video game included, right? There's some kind of like version of Breakout. I hope I have the right title, but Alive in the Superunknown was a CD-ROM, correct?
Correct.
So,
Yeah.
So there's audio content, visual content. I think they wanted to include some interactive content. So I think if you went into the menu, you could access, around that time, the song Superunknown from the album,
Right.
the eponymous album, they did, we did not generate this, but people at the label asked permission. They wanted to try some kind of digital animation, and they did some digital animation for the song Superunknown with our permission, and we looked at the final version just to see, it was a bit of an experiment on their part and our part, and MTV actually aired it. I remember watching MTV airing this weird, crappy digital animation for on Headbangers Ball. So it's like, okay, well, so in a way it was released as a video, and we considered the song Superunknown as a single, at that point, even though it was primarily promotional and experimental. So yeah, around that time they're doing that. DVDs, the idea of a CD, CDs were increasing in popularity. Video games were becoming huge in popularity. Do you remember Microsoft had an encyclopedia called Encarta?
Oh, right. Yeah, absolutely.
Around then. I did some audio for that. They tracked some guitar noises I did to become page turners. Like if you move from one screen to another, you hear like that was in some of the pages. Yeah, it was.
You see, that belongs online somewhere because I don't think I've ever read that. That belongs somewhere.
Yeah. So that was kind of an era of experimentation with these new formats and trying to see what people are interested in, and we were willing guinea pigs. But this was not so much band generated, but it was band approved. So generally we don't think of Alive in the Superunknown or Loudest Love. They're part of the Soundgarden discography, but they weren't an original recording or release on our part. It was more of a sampler of the label's part.
Now to finish off the big round number tour, just the other day was the 20th anniversary of the No WTO Combo release, which I think is out of print right now, or it has been. And it's not something I'd thought about in a long time, but I know that was really specifically, that was one show that you guys did there. Could there have been more shows? Was there ever supposed to be any more than what happened?
No, I think we got to. I think Jello, contacted Krist and wanted to get a band together to play for the WTO. It ended up being Riots, but at the time there was going to be some protests, and at the time Krist and I had been playing together along with Alfredo Hernandez from the last incarnation of Kayas and the original incarnation of Queens of the Stone Age. So we had Fredo and Bubba Dupree from Boyd and Earth 18. The four of us were jamming at the time, and then Jello contacted Krist, and Krist called me and said, "Hey, you should play guitar in this thing." Because of generally shared political sentiments. And then we got Gina on drums, and that was that. I think there might have been some discussion of playing some other shows, and it just didn't really materialize because it's such a dramatic and somewhat traumatic, at least civilly, for Seattle, that whole incident. It had repercussions that extended, many months. It was pretty crazy.
Right.
So that was that.
interesting little moment in the discography right there. So, I'll bring it. We'll end here in the present. In the past little while, you've been doing the MC50 stuff, and I know everything in the world is on pause right now. But I'm just kind of curious, like, what's in your musical future? Is there going to be more of that stuff? Do you have anything that you're looking forward to at this point?
There's a number of things that are on hold and a number of things that are proposed. I think recently, was it like maybe last year actually, I did a guitar solo and on I think it's coming out by now. Brian Posehn, the actor and comedian, has put out a metal record, and Scott Ian plays on it, and I do a solo on one song, and Brendan Small from Metalocalypse is on it, so, and a bunch of other guys. That's just what popped in my head right now. I have some interest and offers from some other guys who have been doing stuff in their home studios, and they're, "Hey, Kim, you want to throw something on this?" And it's, "Sure," but I don't have an access to a home studio, and we're locked down. I'd have to go to a friend's studio. I've been living in a new apartment the past year, and I don't have. It's not set up for recording. So there are things all those things are on hold, and I have to hesitate a little bit here because I'm not sure what has come out and what hasn't. There was a tour I was going to do in April with Dave Alvin. I was going to play some guitar in a project that Dave Alvin had come up with. You probably know Dave from the Blasters and the Flesh Eaters. And that was all ready to go, and that was shut down. In March at some point we had to concede that tour wouldn't happen. And there were some other live shows there were some other live opportunities that are being considered, and some recording that's happened. But I'll wait until the principals behind those recordings make announcements, because I'm merely a guest in these situations.
So what about not being a guest? Because you have been a songwriter in the past. You wrote songs for Soundgarden. What stopped the Kim solo record from ever happening?
I think there's probably a lot of reasons. I think at the time I was really fed up with a creative pursuit, songwriting, turning into constant meetings with accountants and lawyers and managers and record company people. It just wasn't interested. And when the band broke up, I was initially interested in going back and playing recreationally, which is what I was able to do, play recreationally. Mm-hmm. And it was really hesitant towards the idea of cobbling together a professional, infrastructure. There were some holdbacks to it when Soundgarden broke up in the late 90s. All the people we knew at A&M were eventually a year or two later, A&M was bought. Everyone we knew there was fired. And then the label was kind of subsumed into Universal. So we had no label. None of the people we worked with at the label were still there. Our manager, Susan Silver, who was our long-term manager and integral to the growth and success of Soundgarden and Krist's solo career. She and Krist took time off and became a mother. So her management company ended up being a post office box and a voicemail. So there was no band, there was no record label, there was no management. And I thought, fine with me. I was kind of getting tired of, accountants and lawyers and managers. I didn't want to go and dig up management. I didn't want to go call up the lawyers. I didn't want to have to go and look for labels. So I just took a 12-pack over and hung out with my friends, and we'd play guitar, and we'd record songs and riffs, and with the hope that maybe someday it would be something. But I enjoyed playing recreationally and was resisting the professional thing because there's just too much that was discouraging, that had become discouraging about it. That's probably the main reason. Another reason is that anything solo, because so much of Soundgarden sound is born of my aesthetic, that anything I had done, because we're a guitar band, I'm the guitarist. I wrote all the guitar parts and all the riffs in the original incarnations of the band. Almost all the music is written by me from 84, on until Hero wrote a lot too. But then Krist started writing more as he got more comfortable with playing guitar. And Matt came in, and Matt, same thing. He was learning guitar and writing songs, introducing stuff, and bringing their drummer sensibility to things. But anything I would have done would have sounded like Soundgarden without the greatest singer in the world and the greatest drummer in the world. So that was a little bit discouraging too. It's like, why would I want to do a B-grade Soundgarden? You know? So I thought, fuck it. I'll come to the B-grade Soundgarden, then try to find a manager and a lawyer and some accountants. Screw all of it.
In the current era where there's so much, self-releasing and people can kind of just, I'm just saying, as someone who has admired what you've done musically for decades, maybe hopefully that'll find a way out, that you'll find a way. I would love to hear it if it ever happens.
Well, definitely. I mean, after Soundgarden ended this time, I made a mental note of, no, not this time. I'm not going to semi-retire. And of course, I've done a lot of the work with the MC5 anniversary stuff, which has been a lot of fun and really encouraging to be on stage with those guys. But I have a different attitude now, and better, more willing to deal with the side of the music business that had caused me to feel alienated from the creative process.
Kim, thank you so much for taking the time to talk today and going through the whole history lesson. I so appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and thank you for being so knowledgeable. That suggests to me that you're a fan, so that's cool.
All right,
Bye-bye.
Take care. And my thanks, Kim Thayil of Soundgarden. Again, it's the 30th anniversary of the Screaming Life FOPP compilation. Do check that out, or just play any Soundgarden you want to, because there's never a bad time for that. Thanks to you as well. Thanks to you for checking out this episode. Thanks to you for subscribing. If you're not a subscriber, I do hope you got inspired by this one to click that button wherever you're listening from. Of course, that does include iTunes and Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts from. After that, head to WFPK.org, where I do a show Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern. It's an hour full of song premieres and music news, anniversary spins, and bonus interviews as well. Again, that's WFPK.org. Consequence of Sound has your music and film news. You can also find me just about any social media platform, all the big ones anyway, at Kyle Meredith. Hope you like and follow along there. And that does it for another edition. I'm Kyle Meredith. I'll see you next time.
Consequence Podcast Network.
I'm Lior Phillips, host of This Must Be the Gig. We're a weekly podcast that documents everything about the world of live music, speaking with choreographers, costume and set designers, the people who run beloved venues and festivals, and, of course, speaking with musicians about that one gig that changed their lives. Get your peek behind the curtain at consequenceofsound.net, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.